Hello and welcome to Skeindeer Knits. My name is Ellie and I am a Norwegian living and knitting in London. And you can find me on Instagram as Skeindeer and I am Skeindeer Knits as a designer on Ravelry. And there is the Ravelry group Skeindeer Knits, which is the best place to take part in knit-alongs and get in touch and help with patterns and all that stuff, you know, the usual drill. Why is it that this is like, what, episode 157, and the more I do this, the worse I am at saying the exact same words at the beginning of every episode. Anyway, what have I been doing for 156 episodes so far? Well, to new viewers, I normally just sit here and talk about knitting. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, I have a little list. It shouldn't take that long to find the word list in here, but there we are. I am running a knit-along, just one right now, which is the Skeindeer Knits Garment Cal of 2021, and all you need to do to take part is to make one or several of my garment patterns during the year of 2021 and submit in the thread that I've still yet to make in the Ravelry group, or use the hashtag on Instagram. I do have great plans of making like one big like kind of collection piece of all the submitted garment photos, because we did that last year, though I did piece them up, and I'm still yet to decide whether I'm gonna do one big or several quite big ones. But I'm still really excited because this is honestly, without a doubt, the best part about designing knitting garments or knitting patterns is when people make them themselves and you get to see their versions, the modifications, the color choice and how they style it, and yarn choice and just all that stuff is like the best part. There's no contest even, it is the best part. Aside from said knit-along, I do have some new patterns, and then I have two finished objects. They're quite modest, but that's what I have, and I got some yarn purchases as well. So that's just what we're going to talk about today. Anyway, I'm probably going to find some way to talk about gauge somehow as well, because why wouldn't I? That's kind of what I do. And I do have a few things to say about gauge. Anyway, new patterns. I did talk about this pattern last time, which is the socks that I have come to name the probably cursed socks. The story is actually quite simple and probably very relatable to a lot of knitters out there, especially those of us who have sort of climbed the ladder from accessory knitters to garment knitters. Not that it's always in that order, it certainly wasn't for me, but you know, and have a bit of second sock syndrome or first sock syndrome or just sock syndrome. So this is what they look like. So the reason that I call them the probably cursed socks is because I started designing these socks I think in 2018. I believe I bought this yarn from Stranded Dye Works back in, I think it was February 2018, that sounds about right. And immediately I had this like amazing plan for the design, and I remember charting it down and had this really cool idea as well, which we'll get back to, about changing the stitch count for the leg and the foot so that they are slightly different. Because you often do want different stitch counts for colour work than you do for stockinette when it comes to socks, but we'll get to that when we get to that. So I started this process back in 2018. So one major reason that this took a while is just because the stages between the initial planning and the cast on was just quite long for whatever reason. I'm sure I was planning for the second mitten club at that point, so a lot of things going on. So this was just like a thing that took a while to cast on, but once I had cast it on, I do remember knitting on this on a plane, which was probably Vogue Knitting Live either 2019 or 2020 to New York or back. So they've been a trusty whip companion for quite some time, and it's obviously because I have how many projects? Probably over 50, and I am also working on a PhD. And so they just weren't a priority because I had all these other garments that need to be finished. It takes longer to do garments, you just end up prioritizing the garments all the time. And there's just like a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with these socks. But because they kept just laying around this project bag, it always kept very visible, so I remembered to finish them. I was like, well, I guess they're probably cursed or something because they're not done yet. So they're probably cursed socks. And then I thought, well, if they're gonna be called that and Halloween's coming up, then that is a pretty good launch date. So I released them on Halloween, and it was done in quite a hurry because I had a kind of, I guess, Halloween date with some friends where basically half of us dressed up as Wednesday Addams, or at least two of us did, and met up at Nando's. And after 2 hours at Nando's, I was like, I'm going home. And then I found that a select few of the people who were so kind to buy this pattern when it was brand new had some problems with getting the payment accepted. I kept getting these PayPal emails in return just saying that, hey, we rejected the payment because it was violating something. And I was like, I've done this for how many years now? 4 or 5? This has never happened. What is it? And I was like, Is it because they're called cursed? Because I've heard people had problems with PayPal in the past if they have put a naughty word in it. But like, I was part of the like tits out collective back when, and that word wasn't banned. So what was the issue here? Well, I had to become quite the spreadsheet detective because PayPal was no use whatsoever. They could not tell me why they done it or undo it. So I don't know what the point of that customer service is. But anyway, I had to get a spreadsheet and look at everyone and compare those who had been successful at buying it, which was most people, and those who hadn't been. And I found that the common thread for the people who had not been able to buy it were US based and using either of the two discount codes. One is on the newsletter and one is on Instagram. And obviously had bought these socks. So I was like, but the codes are different. Why would either code do that? So the only thing that they had in common is the like little message that you get when you check out with the pattern. So if you type in whatever discount code to whatever designer, you get a message saying, hey, this code gives you this 20% discount, blah, blah, blah. And then that message was the reason, which is the same copy paste message I've always used. Anyway, I just changed the message to happy knitting because people already know what the code does. So I figured out whatever, just try use some totally different words. And that worked. So probably cursed socks. Yeah, probably. Probably not though. But yeah, so that's about the story of the name. So now you know that and it's living up to its potential. So that's good. We love that. I love some cheeky socks that, you know, are doing a bit of a trick, if you will, on Halloween. So the pattern. We can talk about the yarn first and then we can get into the details. So yes, as I said, I bought this from Stranded Dye Works back in 2018. So this was a Valentine themed colorway called Anti-Valentine, which he hasn't dyed up since I think the year after that. So this hasn't been a colorway in duration for quite some time. So just do not harass him for the colorway. I do believe there's like a remake of the colorway gonna happen at some point. But having said that, I mean, there are so many other lovely colorways to choose from, so. But of course I had to go with this colorway because isn't it just very, very me? So I'm really, really pleased with this result. And that is what I have to say about the yarn, other than it's a Blue Face Leicester nylon blend, your usual kind of 400 meters per 100 grams, although these have slightly less. But you can also have something that has slightly more. It's just like a rough ballpark sock yarn. Just make sure it has a good percentage of nylon if you do use nylon to strengthen your socks. I know people feel different about that, but that's just my personal recommendation, a sort of trade-off of the plastic content versus durability. So there's that. Yes, the pattern. Let's get into the details, the nitty-gritty, if you will. So the toe up. And what I like about these socks, especially for me who do tend to lose my sock mojo, is that these have quite a lot of points of interest. So you start off with a toe cast on, which is the same one that you probably always used if you've done toe up socks. I do link to the method in the pattern if you haven't. And then you just increase on each side of these like little... Anyway, and then you get to do a little bit of color work, just right at the tip there. Just a little bit, just to keep the interest going. And then you do stockinette from about like here to here-ish. Yeah. So not too long. You don't get tired of stockinette this much. I don't think, no, even I do. And then you get to increase for the gusset. So this isn't going to be too different for those of you who have done colorwork socks with a toe up gusset before, but for those of you who haven't, and maybe if you have a bit of sock anxiety as well, I love the toe up heel flapping gusset. Like I can do cuff down heel flapping gusset fine now, but I remember when I was learning it, it blew my mind. Like you first do the flap and then you pick up on the side and then you do the round and then you decrease. And there's a turn as well. No. When you do top down, the same thing. You almost don't realize that you're doing it. And I don't know how that works. It's magic, whatever. But anyway, so after you've done these increases all the way here, you have a lot of stitches now. And then you do a heel turn. There's a lot of different heel turns out there, but I actually like to use what is basically half of a German short row heel. It's a little bit different, but that's basically what it comes down to. So if you've done any short row heel before, you'll be fine. And once you've done that, all you're doing is just knitting the heel flap back and forth while decreasing the stitches that you had made. That's it. It is like, there's none of that picking up stuff, the weird turn that some cuff down socks have. I mean, I've talked about this heel a lot before, but it's been a while, so for those of you who haven't heard me rave about that, I can highly recommend it. I remember the years and years ago when I tried out the toe up, heel flap and gusset, and just how it blew my mind. I was like, you mean it can be that easy? I personally have no preference about which kind of sock direction I prefer. Cuff down is really good for adjusting sock length. Toe up is really good for making sure you're not using up too much yarn, or you know, using up all your yarn if that's what you want. But the heel for toe up. But anyway, you carry on then doing color work all the way up, and then you do a tiny little bit of a ribbed cuff here, not too much. I don't personally like too much rib on the cuffs, but you can do it longer if you like them longer, but this is just how much I prefer. Two things I want to add. One is a lot of people have different tension for color work and stockinette. If you know that that's usually you, I would just do your usual kind of sock needle for the stockinette and check it with a gauge just in case. But you know, like if you don't want swatch for socks, because who do really? Just go up to the next needle size for the color work. So you do the stockinette first. Don't mind this part, it's not enough to bother with. But when you get to this part, you may just want to go up to the next needle size if you know that you do tend to knit color work tighter than stockinette. So that's just one side note. But the main thing I wanted to talk about, which is what I said in the beginning, there's a difference in stitch count for the foot and the leg. There's basically a slight switching of placement of a marker here once you just before you're starting the gusset increase, so that basically you are increasing for more gusset stitches than you are decreasing when you get to the heel flap. Normally these will be the same count. You increase here, you decrease here, so that you get the same stitch count for the foot and the sock leg. I'm sure you're all familiar with that if you've done socks before. That's the normal way of going about it. But because we have a stockinette foot and a colorwork leg, I wanted the stitch count for the leg to be what I think is a good stitch count for colorwork, but for the foot, what I think is good for stockinette. Because you normally want socks to be tight and have negative ease, but colorwork generally want no ease and maybe even a bit of positive ease. Because if you're stretching out the colorwork, that's not really very nice. And so that's how I did it. So the difference is about an inch from foot to leg. Obviously, if the easier way of going around that would just be using a much bigger needle size for the leg. If you find another pattern that isn't mine, that doesn't do this, that is a way of going around that. If you wanted a more snug stockinette foot and looser colorwork leg. But in order to keep the gauge consistent from foot to leg, I just wanted to make sure that the stitch count change is incorporated into the pattern already. So there's some secrets also for you there. And yeah, I think that's all I have to say. I do really like this pattern as well. It's got enough interest. So once you've done so much of the sock, you're like, ah, finally there's something that I can like dig my brain into. Yeah, got a kind of funky lightning kind of pattern. And that would be the probably cursed socks that are probably not cursed. But they're finally out, and if there's one sign that they're not cursed, it's that I finally published them after so many years. I finally published them. So now they're probably the probably blessed socks, but anyway. I cringe. So that is the pattern release there. Now before I get into my works in progress, finished objects, whatever you want to call that, I do actually have another design to talk about as well, which will be launched as soon as I put up this video, I reckon, so it'll be out by the time you're watching it. This is the third pattern in the Matchy Matchy Club, or Matchy Matchy Accessory Club, I believe I called it. Last time I talked about the cowl pattern. That was the first sort of secret pattern to be released, and I couldn't for the life of me find it. It was in a bag, up on some shelf, as it is usually the case in my room. So now I have both that pattern and the new pattern that is coming out, I guess, today. So this is the cowl that I couldn't find last time. It is just a kind of average sized colorwork cowl. I don't know what else to say. It's just easily wearable. I also put some notes in the pattern for how you can adjust for size if you want bigger circumference. I've said how much like adding a chart repeat adds to your circumference. Obviously you can knit to whatever length you want. That is pretty modifiable. So let's just try it on and just mess up what I had that kind of resemble a good hair day. There we go. That's the endeløs cowl. Normally the way I write Norwegian, I would call it the endeløs cowl, but that would have the Ø letter in it, which is the letter that looks like an O with a dash through it. It's a letter called Ø, And I know from experience just not putting any funky letters into my pattern names, because this is not, people are going to be using the letter O anyway, aren't they? So we're just not doing that. So I went with Endelose, which has a more old-fashioned ring to it anyway. And it is what you call these types of pattern repeats. So this is an Endelose pattern. And yeah, that, well, it means endless. I hope that kind of went without saying. But it is just an infinite repeat of a typical Norwegian pattern. So this does come from Sarbury as well. I did modify it quite a bit to make it look like this. It's not quite what the original chart looks like, but sometimes I just want to fiddle with things, okay? Okay. So yes, I know I said it wasn't a Sarbu mitten club, but most of the things I do have a bit of Sarbu in it is my local kind of knitting background. So, you know, it is what it is. So this is made in a combination of Navia Duo, the red yarn, and Finul by Doma with the grey yarn. You could also use Sandnes Tove and Hillesvåg Ask, Hillesvåg Vilja. There's a lot of really good yarns. I would actually, if you want a tighter gauge, just go up to the next yarn thickness for Hillesvåg. Like Sol and Tinde, they're usually pretty good for getting the garments slightly warmer. But anyway, you wanted to hear about the new pattern in the club, and I did say matchy matchy, so hold on to that thought, because this is the most matchy matchy to this pattern in the collection. The next two are probably going to be a smidge different, but anyway, it's a hat. It's the Endless hat, so now you can match. I told you it was the matchy matchy club. Having watched these videos for about 5 years now, you know what to expect. If I say it's matchy matchy, it is matchy matchy. So that's, I should have worn something that's like more, I don't know. There we go. Hey. So I know what you're thinking. Does that mean I can do both with one skein each color? I want to say yes, but I was very close when I'd finished this hat to like realize that it's a close call. So yeah, you can. Probably, but I don't want to make any promises. I think I made the second largest hat size, so you'd probably be fine. I use 50 grams each, but it was a close call, and I do tend to add an extra little bit in my patterns because we all knit a little bit differently. So even if you get, you know, perfect gauge and everything, some people could still use more yarn than I did, so that's just sort of part of it. I am so pleased with this hat. Oh my god, I'm gonna take this off now because it's actually quite warm inside. Here is the hat, and you can see the crown here. Look at this crown. I've never done a crown this good before. And I've done some crowns, but this one is I just liked it. The main thing I really like about it is that with these sort of thick red stripes that appear as you do the crown, makes it so much easier to decrease in color work and not kind of lose track of things, and also not be kind of stuck at, you know, what do you do where you have these stitches between the decreases and the decrease stitches themselves. Actually, the rule of thumb is always just lean on the contrast color for that. It's so much easier. So that's the hat, and that's the cowl. That means we are halfway through the club, and I am gonna have to put in an apology to someone who never asked for it, because actually everyone's been totally fine with the pace of this club, but I know that in my head, though I hadn't told anyone, I had planned to have this hat out just a little bit sooner. And so I'm apologizing to whoever maybe read my mind and expected that. It is out now, and I really hope you enjoy it. They're both incredibly quick and beginner-friendly color work. I'm always like a little bit hesitant to say beginner-friendly because I find that one of two things happen. And this is really interesting, and this is coming from like I guess my 5 years of experience of doing this stuff now, is that the most common response if you say that something's beginner-friendly, I swear you could put that on any pattern and people consider themselves to be beginners go, oh, that means I can do that, and they do it, and they just do it. It's just like a word you put on something to give people confidence sometimes. And so my history with that was when I did the quicker Sarbu mittens. So the way I described these patterns was, I have made this pattern for my classes to teach beginners how to make Sarbu mittens. Beginners as in people who haven't done colorwork mittens before. Beginners to colorwork mittens. I'm pretty sure I was quite clear about that. People saw the word beginner and they may rarely have knitted before, and they were like, oh, beginner pattern, and I really want to make those, and so they did. And so it's quite tempting to put beginner on everything because it's just, this has this magical effect on people. that they go, oh, that means I can make that. I'm like, well, yeah, you always could. You always could. Like, the main factor of a pattern is so-called beginner friendly. It's got nothing to do with whether it's beginner friendly, because that term is kind of useless and relative. The main factor is how much you want to make it. That is the be-all end-all, really. Like, you can draw like color works up patterns with gussets and increases and decreases and all sorts as your beginner pattern. If nobody tells you that's difficult, you don't think it's difficult. If someone told you it's a beginner friendly thing and you see yourself as a beginner, there's something weird psychologically there that I'm sure I could find some research papers on, but I find it fascinating. So why would I not just call these beginner friendly? Well, I actually do. Well, they have all the things that I consider to be very good for beginner friendly color work. The pattern is quite logical, symmetrical, so it doesn't kind of throw you off completely. It is a very nice circumference, because once you do something like socks and mittens, the circumference is so small that you have to also fiddle with DPNs or magic loop or tiny circulars. Whereas here you can use a 16-inch circular, 40 centimeters. My point with this ramble is just that you don't want the circumference to be too small or too big. Too big obviously means the whole project takes longer. If you make a mistake, there's more to go back on, all that stuff. Also easy to lose steam, unless you're like me and you only lose steam with tiny things like the socks instead of garments, but anyway. But also it's not so small that you, like I said, have to fiddle with really like tiny circumferences, because that can be quite tough. So I think color work cowls are perfect beginner patterns, and this is one of those. So there, if you haven't done color work, or you're still not super confident, you want to practice your tension or whatever, it's a pretty good start. But then you can upgrade to the hat, because really, though the hat is different in gauge and stitch count and stuff, you can get all the way up here and it's almost the same, apart from the things I just mentioned. And then you get to do something new, which is the decreasing for the crown that I just described. So you get to kind of step up a little bit every time. So that's kind of how I made this club. Not because it is a beginner club, because it isn't, but I do want it to be accessible for people who, I say consider themselves beginner, because I do find that people who call themselves beginners, I wouldn't personally call them that. Like, I've heard people call themselves beginners even though they knitted for years, even though they made several things. I would definitely call them intermediate. My definition of a beginner is someone who knows how to knit, maybe purl. They probably learned how to cast and bind off. They just begun and know the basics. That's my idea of beginner. And I find a lot of people use beginners on themselves when they actually know a lot more than that. But that's a side point. Just thought I'd explain my hang up with the name. And did I call myself beginner longer than I should have as well? Yes, of course I did. This is about me in the end. But yeah, another reason that I maybe not put like, this is a beginner club on the club itself is because it is for everyone. So even if I wasn't the one making the club, I'd probably buy it because I would enjoy knitting those things, because I made them so that I would enjoy them as well. And so I think it's pretty universal appeal, if you will. And I do also sometimes hesitate to put the beginner label on, because even though the vast majority of people take confidence from that term, there is the 0.001% that is like, you call this beginner, but I made a mistake. You're a bad designer. It's like, oh my God, beginner doesn't mean that I'm knitting it for you, honey. But that is the internet for you. Yeah, off the top of my head, I have totally forgot how many sizes the hat comes in, but it's got multiple sizes, so that's multiple different stitch counts that will give you different repeat counts of these sort of flowers, if you will. So these are the two current patterns that were a mystery in the club. We are halfway. There's also the lace shawl pattern that was part of the launch. I've really been enjoying seeing you guys knit them and tag me on Instagram. I'm going to try to be a bit more present on Instagram again. I really haven't been for the past half year, and I've suffered the consequences, shall we say, and it's just, I think it's tough for everyone. And I was talking to quite a few of you on a live stream I did there a few days ago, where a lot of you guys have been feeling the same way, that we're just not really seeing each other there anymore. So for me, as someone who makes a living of this, that's obviously a very, very, very bad thing. And after New Year's, I'm gonna have to go get a job. But also I can solve that with having a newsletter, so when people sign up, at least I can't, you know, Instagram can't take that away from me at least. But it doesn't solve the issue that we're having. We're not actually talking to each other and feeling the knitting community like the way we used to, where we're more connected. And so I'm like, we need a new app. I foresee that I'm probably going to be starting like an Instagram, Twitter in a month's time. I say in a month's time because I'm not allowed to do anything until I'm at my PhD revision deadline. But yeah. So I'm thinking of like, what can we do about this as a community? Not that I can decide what the community is going to do. I'm sure it's just going to happen organically when we have a platform that does what we need it to do, which I don't think Instagram does anymore. It's more about videos and reels and ads and just shopping and none of the things that we used it for, to share photos of our knitting and talking to each other. So yeah, maybe I'll do Twitch. But again, that's also a little bit of a, you know what would be great, and I'm just thinking out loud now, but in a month's time, we'll pick up on this one again. Twitter has launched something that's called Spaces, where you can basically start a chat. Now there's no video there and there's no typing either, so it would have been better if it had at least some writing so it could be a little bit more accessible. But I'm not just the one doing the talking. We can be doing the talking, so you can just like click your microphone and then you be talking as well. I'm like, yeah. What if we did that for knitting? So I'm thinking about that. Let me know what you think, and we can look into that in a couple of weeks. I'm just trying to be innovative here because I'm so fed up with this Instagram thing. It's just not happening for me. But that's not what I was going to talk about, was it? I have finished objects. There hasn't been a lot of finished objects on this podcast for a while, and the reason is obviously that I have been focusing a lot on my designs this year because I have a lot of them to catch up on. I'm still too stubborn to outsource things, although I have started to do some. I just want to make them. That's why I design them, because I want to make them. As you can see, one in the background here that's going to come out in a couple of weeks. It should be ready already, and I'm going to try to get it out ASAP. I'm really excited about it. It's something I've been wanting to do for years. I've seen my test knitters versions and oh, they look so good. And I really hope you're going to like it. I just hope that I'll finish it in time. It's quite the... I'm not gonna hint at that. That is the hint. That's all you get to see today. But really, yeah, like the only work in progress that I've cast on this year and not yet bound off that is not one of my designs is Theo Coleman's Widow's Kiss. For someone who used to cast on projects all the time from all sorts of designers, that's kind of strange. Like, what happened to me? But it is good that I'm getting, you know, more focused on my own stuff. But having said that, I have been making two little things for my nephew that are not my designs, and I'm going to show you now. Behind me! Ha! I need to weave in the ends, but I still call things finished even though I haven't woven in the ends, and you should be used to that by now if you've been watching this for years. So I made hats for my nephew. So my nephew got this little orange hat in Skeindeer Yarn by KNITALONG Knits that he's almost too big for. And so my sister found that hat incredibly useful and wanted me to make another one. And so I made one in the biggest size in Easy Knits yarn. I forgot the name of, but it's the same yarn I use for the underground mittens. So this is the hat. Looks a bit scary when I do this, but I have no model here, so I'm just gonna have to make do. When the hat is blocked out, you do get like a quite big opening for the face. So it looks a bit weird now having this little like Kenny from South Park opening here, especially when I had made the orange one. My goodness. These are so handy. And this yarn as well is so soft and woolly. It's quite a bit thicker than the Skeindeer yarn that I used. So that means that this could probably be used on its own, whereas the Skeindeer hat would be something that he would be wearing under another hat. These can actually be worn on their own. So this one is another size bigger. I think this one's up to like 3 years and this was about like 4 or something. So that it looks quite small now, but again, it's garter, it's rib, so it gets quite big. I'm sure if I had a slightly smaller head, but still like an adult size head, I could probably wear it, but my head is enormous, so don't measure according to my head size. But yeah, so that's that hat. And this is dyed by Easy Knits. This is an undyed skein, but this one has dye on it in case you can't see. So yeah, gotta weave in the end. So yeah, I'm just really pleased with having both of these made for him, because I think, well, he's growing, so that means I'm ahead of this. He'll have 2 hats, and I imagine once he starts to become a slightly bigger, more opinionated boy, if he's anything like his family members, he'd probably prefer something that's gonna make him look all tough, like his auntie. That is gonna be sent off to him closer to Christmas, I imagine, unless I go there myself, which is still yet to be decided. I don't have any works in progress, but I have been buying some yarn. How? Why? Don't I have enough yarn? Well, when there's a sale and it's Midwinter Yarns, Midwinter Yarns is one of my favourite yarn shops in the UK. They are online mostly, although I do tend to run into them at yarn shows, though there haven't been many of those to have there lately. So when they had a sale, of course I was going to buy. And given how hard it is for me to get hold of Norwegian yarn lately, at least I can get a lot of other Scandinavian yarns from their shop. So highly recommended for anyone in the UK or wherever else they ship to. But I thought I'd talk about the yarns that I did get. So they came in these little bag here, and it's all charcoal because let's not kid anyone. I don't wear a lot of colour most of the time, so if I'm going to be wearing it, might as well. So I bought one sweater quantity of Ulligen, which is a recycled yarn, Swedish recycled yarn. I'm going to read a bit from the blurb, if you will. It's 50 grams, 100% recycled wool. Got 230 meters per 50 gram ball, but the gauge recommended is 22 stitches. So let me just rave about this. I haven't actually knitted with it yet, but just look, first of all, getting a bit closer. Look at how thick this yarn is. Remember I just said 230 meters per 50 grams. I would have guessed this would be more like maybe 180 meters, but no, 230. And on top of that, you can knit that at a 22 stitch gauge. This is gonna go a long way. I think I'd probably prefer to knit it slightly tighter, but like, hell yeah. So I don't know what I'm gonna be making with this yet, but it's really soft, which is the other thing I wanted to rave about. Recycled wool is so lovely. I don't know what they do. It's just because it's been worn so much, and that's usually the case with wool, is that once you wear it a lot, it gets softer. And so this is really the max point there of how soft it can be. There's not a single mention of superwash, so how? But it's just absolutely lovely, and very excited to do whatever garment I end up making with it. But I think this is gonna be on a fast track lane to the stash right now, because I got a lot of other things to finish up on before I just dare to cast on anything else. The other sweater quantity I got was Snældan. Now I've talked about Snældan before. In fact, this is very similar to the yarn I made the bunad shawl in, except that was a thinner version of Snældan. This is the kind of DK version, whereas that was more of the fingering weight version. So I believe this one has, yeah, 3 plies and the other one had 2. Even though it's a 3 ply, it still feels like the sort of 2 ply thing. That this reminds me of something else I was going to talk about. My goodness, I'm so glad I remembered that. So let's just wrap up this. This is just lovely Faroese yarn. Again, I love these Nordic yarns. So a lot of them have that scratchy reputation. This is not scratchy. This is lovely. I love my shawl in this. I mean, imagining how much softer yarn can get after a while. This is already starting out at this point. Yeah, I'm into it. So just to read a bit of information, got 100 grams, made in the Faroese Islands. Pure new wool. And yeah, it's DK, 100% wool, 100 grams, approximately 260 meters. That will be another garment. I probably won't be using these together just because like light fingering, DK, it's not quite the same. But I guess I'll be having 2 charcoal sweaters at some point, or cardigans, or whatever else I fancy making with it. I'm just really glad I got hold of these. They are one of those yarns that I keep looking at and feeling, you know, when I'm at a yarn show where Midwinter Yarns vend. And I always think, oh, I can always get that online from them. I don't need to be buying all this now. Well, the time has come. So anyway, the thing I was going to talk about is just a correction from last time I made a podcast episode, which I said something that I kind of knew was wrong, and I just didn't realize that I knew this until someone actually told me. A few people told me in the comments. So I was comparing the yarns that I'd used for the worsted Otra sweater and cardigan, and sort of talking about how I could get away with using a lot of finer yarn for the woolen spun yarn I used for the cardigan versus the worsted spun yarn that I'd used in the sweater. Except the sweater was also made in woolen spun yarn, and I'd promptly forgotten that, even though on some level I knew. And then I was like, huh? Wait a minute. How? And so, just to do a quick recap, the woolen spun yarn for the cardigan is a very typical woolen spun yarn. You can just recognize by seeing it how it's quite fuzzy, it has quite a halo, and that means you can steek it without sewing. So that means you can cut through it because it's got that halo. It means it's acting a bit like Velcro and will just stick to itself and not want to unravel. It's great. I love it. Those are usually the characteristics of woolen spun yarns. Yet, the Rerum Natura Gilead yarn is actually also woolen spun, and I said it was worsted spun because it's so smooth, which is the usual characteristic of worsted spun yarn because it's been combed to parallel fibers. You don't get those pokey sticky out fibers that give that Velcro effect. But the weird thing about Gilead is, well, it has the loftiness of woolen spun yarn because it is woolen spun. That's how it managed to be so woolly. And you know, when you break the yarn, you can just do this. It's brittle enough that you don't need to apply a lot of force, which with the longer hairs that are combed together, you kind of got to give it a bit of twist to do that. Right, so it is definitely woolen spun, and that's what they say as well. And I like, why did I call it worsted spun? Well, it's just really smooth for worsted spun. And I guess it must be like a quality to do with that particular breed of merino that they use, because I've never seen anything like it. But I also think it's to do with having a lot more plies. So the twist gives the yarn a lot of springiness, which if we're going to compare to this Snældan yarn that does have 3 plies instead of the usual 2 that woolen spun yarns have, it's still not it's not very springy because the plies are very loose. And for some reason, and I don't know how they did that with Gilead, but they managed to make it springy, but not too heavy, even though I'm sure they got the springiness with, you know, appropriate amount of plies and twist. And I think it's mostly the twist. And it's just this incredible best of all worlds combinations of just enough but not too much twist, just enough but not too many plies, just enough but not too much fuzz to give it the halo, to not give it that halo, but to give it the loftiness. I hope that was a good summary. So I kind of corrected myself on that. Thanks for pointing it out so I didn't misinform you guys more than I guess I already had. This is probably why I do love that yarn so much, is because it's got all those good qualities from across worsted and woolen spun, even though it is a woolen spun. Unfortunately, the one quality that I love the most about woolen spun, which is how you can just cut through it without securing, I wouldn't chance that with Gilead. Unfortunately, that is something I've tried in the past. I did know at the time that I needed to sew, was when I did the Lady Marble cardigan, and you could see between where the 2 sewing seams were when I'd cut, it just unraveled. It did not want to stick together. There was no Velcro effect there, so blows my mind how they did that. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to correct there. It's lovely yarn. I love both of them. And it really goes to show how hard it can be to identify what is woolen spun and what is worsted spun, because very few will actually put that on the label, even though the Rerum Natura does put that on the label and I just didn't see it. Honestly, the best and easiest answer to that I can think of is to just have some woolen spun and worsted spun yarn in your stash that you are, or at least just feel them in a shop or whatever, as you know how they feel personally. I don't think you read yourself up on that. You really just need to know, okay, I've had a Finull skein and I know how that feels. I know what that looks like, or spindrift, or 2-ply jump, you know, the list goes on. Then you know what is a typical woolen spun quality. That is also how you can end up making a mistake and mislabeling yarns, but that's the best way of knowing, you know, can I use this yarn and is it good for non-secured steek? I'm running out of stuff to talk about, but there was one thing I wanted to say about gauge. I guess it's because it's been a while since I've talked about it. I've sort of taken a few steps back and sort of wondered, why is it that it's been a thing that people shy away from? Because I always like to go really deep into things and just like talk about it like everyone's on board, and then people go, oh, gauge. Oh. I'm just making accessories. I don't want to think about gauge. I'm like, yeah, they kind of still, it kind of always matters though. It's not just garments. And then people just kind of seem a little bit scared by it and confused by it. And I think because I like to go so in depth about everything, it sort of makes people think that this is something complicated. And so now that I've taken a few steps back, I'm sort of like, oh, I just kind of want to reassure people that it's just not complicated. Like gauge is the simplest thing where you just plop a ruler on your knitting. So you have a piece of preferably stockinette, put a ruler on what is between usually 4 inches, 10 centimeters, count those stitches. That's your gauge. That's your stitch gauge. That is it. And that is why I keep saying you gotta measure it on your garment, not just a swatch. Once you have the garment, forget the swatch. Just measure that. That's your gauge. That's it. That's all you need to know. Added to that, I think it's good to know that, well, if the stitch count within that measure is too many stitches, what that means is, well, there's too many stitches that can fit within that measure, 4 inches or 10 centimeters. If you can fit too many in there, That means they're too small. You can cram more in, they're smaller. That means you've used a too small needle size. You gotta use a bigger needle size. If you got too few stitches in there, that means they're so big you couldn't fit in more of them. So if they're too big, that means you've used too big a needle size. So use a smaller one. That's it. That is gauge. There's nothing mathsy there. You didn't need to know any maths to know this stuff. You gotta count, that's about it. That's it. End of episode. And I suppose it's also good to know what affects your gauge. That is just 3 things normally. It's needle size, right? As I just explained. But also how you tension the yarn. So I know it can get a bit complicated because some people use tension synonymously with gauge. That's usually been the tradition here in the UK. But tensioning is just how tightly you hold the yarn. Some people hold it loose, some people hold it tight. Don't change that stuff. That's how you knit. That's your flow. That's your state of, you're in the zone when you do that. Don't try to mess with that. That's just gonna make it uneven. That's the way you knit. I suggest changing needle size instead of trying to change that. Usually the available needle size exists, although some people knit so loose that there isn't a needle small enough, and I'm sorry. So after needle size and how you tension the yarn personally, the third thing is the thickness of the yarn. And some people aren't affected by that at all. Like I'm not. If I want, say, a 22 stitch gauge, okay, so that's 22 stitches on that measure, it doesn't matter what thickness of yarn I'm using. I will always need the same needle size for that. It's the fiber of the yarn can affect things, but the thickness really does for me. But yeah, different yarns tend to affect how people get different gauge as well. So those are really the 3 things. And the main thing you can influence there is your choice of needle size. Don't try to change how you hold the yarn or anything like that to change the gauge. Honestly, you have your way of knitting that you like. Stick to that. That's how you enjoy knitting. Like I said, that's how you get in the zone. I think that experience is like so important. I wouldn't mess with that. You can just choose a different needle size. And so one thing that I've seen a lot over the years that I've been doing this is when people they've done a swatch, like they've been good, not like me who don't swatch, but they've done a swatch, they've been, and then they got, oh, I got a 22 stitch gauge instead of a 20 stitch gauge in that measure. You put the ruler on. Side note, don't measure the width of the swatch, you measure the stitch count. So you got to have an ample stitch count to measure that. The width of the swatch is not the gauge, okay? Just no. Whatever, so you measure the stitch count. You got 22 stitch gauge instead of 20. I see a lot of people go, oh, well, I guess I'll have to change the entire pattern then. Like, no. Sweetie, I mean, yes, if you want to, if you desperately want that 22 stitch gauge instead of the given 20 of the pattern, I encourage that because that's fun and that's what I like to do when I knit, but that is so much harder than just changing your needle size to what you need to get 20 stitch gauge. You probably just have to go down 1 needle size for that, right? And so I am not here saying that you shouldn't be, changing up a pattern to fit a different gauge that you wanted. If you want that, that's fine. But I generally think that a lot of people think that, oh, when I make a garment, I will make a swatch. The gauge I'm making the swatch is the gauge of that yarn, and that is what I have to use, and I have to change everything else. No. The pattern has laid up everything according to the gauge. Like that's the first thing I put into my spreadsheet. All you gotta do is get the right needle size for that. The pattern's gonna do the rest for you, unless you like to modify, which is another area. So that's kind of this summary. This is what could have been my 2-hour lecture on gauge. Is really quite simple. So just to summarize it, gauge is simply the stitch count within 10 centimeters, 4 inches. When you plop a ruler on your garment, if the stitches are too big, you've used a too big needle size, go down. If the stitches are too small, you use the too small needle size, go up. Small stitches, you can count more stitches within a measure because they're smaller, right? If they are too big, you can't count that many within that measure. That's the logic. That's all you gotta know. The only thing I would try to alter is your needle size. If you want to change anything else, that's great. But the easiest route is changing needle size. And that's all. That's it. That's my TED talk. And that's really all the knitting content. So for the personal stuff in the end, it's not really a whole lot to say. I guess my social life has re-emerged post-London lockdown, which is quite interesting. And I am working so much on my PhD thesis revisions that I had 6 months to work on. And of course I started in the 6th month because you guys know me by now. So I don't really have time to do a whole lot of other things than that. Is just a lot of nitpicky stuff to just make sure that, you know, I don't have any typos and that my captions for the figures are complete and explain everything. It's just, it's like watching paint dry, but you have to go. That's the best way of describing just how incredibly dull that is. And once I get past that deadline and that's approved, that's it. That's finally the PhD over and done with. Yeah. So that's what's happening here. I try to do nice things as well. It's not just all work, work, work. I go out and have dinner with some friends every week, though. I had a day on Cambridge last weekend, so, you know, trying to live a little as well. So I hope you guys are doing okay out there. What else? Whatever you're doing, whatever you're knitting on. And as ever, I want to thank you so much for watching, for signing up to my newsletter that I am so incredibly bad at plugging, but I've remembered it this time. It is the best way to make sure that you don't miss out what I do when whatever platform that we rely on to meet each other on online fail us. I think it's just such a good way of like locking that down. I usually just email people like once or twice a month at most. And yeah, that's all I got. I just said that and I'm the worst at wrapping up videos. I'll just say thanks so much for watching and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.